Chapter 1. The Scream in the Night. The wind was different that evening, an unnatural stillness that hung in the air, as though the planet itself held its breath, waiting for something, anything, to break the silence. The only noise was the soft rustle of the dense alien foliage that surrounded the small clearing where Jason stood, his boots sinking into the damp earth, his eyes scanning the darkness ahead. He had heard about the dangers of this world, the savage creatures, the hostile environment, and the myths that the colonists told around their campfires. It was the kind of place that people who wanted to escape from the rest of the galaxy came to hide, to disappear into the wilderness. Jason had heard it all before, but this was different. For the past several hours, Jason had been trekking through the thick woods of the alien planet, a place on the fringes of known space, far away from the bustle of civilization. He had been on a routine reconnaissance mission for his company, a small but profitable mining operation that had recently begun to exploit the planet's resources. He wasn't one to complain about the isolation, the endless work that came with surveying this desolate, half-charted world. But tonight, something had changed. Something had disturbed the quiet rhythm of the night, and it wasn't just the usual hum of alien insects or the occasional snarl of distant wildlife. This sound, it was human, unmistakably human, and filled with so much agony that it sent a cold chill down his spine. Jason's heart had stopped for a split second when he first heard it, a scream, raw and filled with terror, coming from somewhere deep in the forest. It didn't belong. Not to any creature that he knew, and certainly not to any human. It was a desperate cry, one that carried with it the weight of someone on the brink of death, someone who knew that time was running out. And for a brief, horrifying moment, Jason stood there frozen, unsure of what to do. It was the kind of sound that paralyzed you with fear, the kind of noise that made you question everything you thought you knew about survival, about your place in the universe. But he had been trained to respond to danger, to threats. His instincts as a scout kicked in, overriding any hesitation. With a swift motion, he grabbed his weapon, a compact plasma rifle, and slung it across his chest. He had no idea what was out there, but he had a duty to investigate, to protect the colony, to ensure that nothing, no matter how strange or dangerous, threatened the peace that had been painstakingly built here. The colony had only been established a few years ago, and though they had encountered some unusual creatures, nothing prepared them for this. Nothing had prepared Jason for the sound that now echoed in the air, a sound that seemed to be growing louder, closer. He pushed through the dense underbrush, his boots crushing wet leaves beneath him as he advanced into the forest. The trees here were massive, their thick trunks rising into the darkness, their branches creating a canopy that filtered out most of the moonlight. The air was thick with humidity, and every breath Jason took felt heavy, filled with the unfamiliar scent of alien plants and the dampness of the forest floor. He had come across strange flora in his travels, some harmless, others toxic, but none of that mattered now. Not when perhaps someone from the colony was in danger. The scream came again, more desperate this time, echoing through the trees. Jason's pulse quickened, and he pushed harder, his muscles burning with the effort as he continued to cut through the underbrush. Every instinct told him to be cautious, to watch his back and tread carefully. But the urgency in that scream made him reckless, spurred him forward with the single-minded determination to help. Whoever was out there, wherever they were, was in dire need of assistance. And Jason wasn't going to let them die alone in the wilderness. It didn't take long before Jason found the source of the scream. His foot slipped on a slick patch of ground, and as he stumbled forward, he saw it. A small clearing up ahead, the faint glow of a fire flickering in the distance. His breath caught in his throat. There, in the center of the clearing, were figures, dark shapes moving in the firelight. But these weren't people. These were aliens, creatures he had only seen in passing or through the data from previous expeditions. They were tall, thin, and wiry, with elongated limbs and sharp, angular features. Their skin was mottled, covered in patches of rough scales, and their eyes glowed with an unnatural hue. They were the tribal aliens that had been rumored to inhabit this part of the planet, the ones who preferred to remain hidden from the outside world, untouched by human interference. But what Jason didn't expect to see was the girl. No, not a girl, but a woman who was chained to a post, her body limp and covered in bruises. She was suspended in the air by thick metal shackles, her arms bound above her head as she hung there helplessly. Her body was trembling, her breath coming in shallow gasps as the tribal aliens moved around her, gesturing with long, sharp implements that glinted in the firelight. And the smell Jason recoiled, the stench of burning flesh rising from the fire pit at the center of the clearing. They were grilling her. The woman's skin was raw, scorched by the heat, as the creatures continued to move around her, preparing to turn her into their meal. Jason's heart lurched in his chest. His mind screamed at him to do something, anything. He couldn't just stand there and watch. But his rational mind struggled to process what he was seeing. It wasn't just an alien encounter, it was an act of brutality, a savage display of power. They were using this woman, and they were going to kill her. No, not kill her, consume her. He tightened his grip on the plasma rifle, his knuckles turning white. His breath came in quick, shallow bursts. But he knew that hesitation would cost him. He wasn't trained for this kind of situation, he wasn't an officer, wasn't part of the military. He was a scout, a mechanic, a survivalist. But he wasn't a coward. And he wasn't going to let this woman die alone, not if he could do something about it. His mind raced as he surveyed the situation. There were 5 tribal aliens, each one standing around the fire, the girl dangling between them. They hadn't noticed him yet. They were too focused on their twisted ritual. He could see the hunger in their eyes, the savagery that lay just beneath their alien features. But Jason wasn't about to let them get away with it. He took a deep breath and fired his plasma rifle. The shot rang out, a burst of bright blue energy streaking across the clearing. The blast hit the nearest alien in the chest, sending it tumbling backward, its body convulsing as it let out a strange, guttural scream. The others turned in alarm, their eyes widening in shock, but Jason didn't hesitate. He fired again, hitting another one in the leg, causing it to stumble and fall to the ground. He could see the panic in their movements, the uncertainty creeping into their expressions as they realized someone had found them. But Jason wasn't just hunting them, he was saving her. The woman in the chains let out a weak cry as the fire crackled behind her, the intense heat licking at her skin. She was barely conscious, but Jason could see her chest rise and fall with every shallow breath. His heart hammered in his chest, but he couldn't stop now. There was no time for fear. He had to finish this. The remaining tribal aliens charged forward, their weapons raised high, but Jason was ready. He fired once more, a shot that struck the last alien squarely in the chest, knocking it to the ground with a thud. The clearing fell silent. The remaining tribal aliens were either incapacitated or dead, and the woman was free. Jason ran forward, his heart pounding in his ears, and rushed to her side. He could see the tears streaming down her face, the raw, brutal marks of her captivity etched into her skin. The chains were thick, rusted, but not impossible to break. He pulled out his multi-tool, the familiar click of its mechanism as he worked to free her. "Hang in there," Jason whispered, his voice hoarse with adrenaline. "I'm getting you out of here." Jason worked quickly, the vibrations from the plasma rifle shots still ringing in his ears as he approached the woman, whose barely conscious eyes fluttered open to meet his. She was chained to a post, her limbs battered and bruised from the harsh treatment. Her breathing was shallow, her chest rising and falling with each painful breath, but there was a spark of recognition in her eyes. She was alive, but barely. "Hang in there," Jason said, his voice a whisper, more for himself than for her. His fingers worked deftly, adjusting the multi-tool as he tried to break the chain that held her in place. Sweat beaded on his forehead, not just from the heat of the fire, but from the sheer urgency of the situation. Every second felt like an eternity. The firelight danced around them, casting long shadows on the trees and the alien ground. But Jason couldn't focus on anything but the woman's pain. Her eyes narrowed slightly as she lifted her head, clearly fighting the haze of exhaustion and pain. "Who are you?" she rasped, her voice hoarse, barely audible over the crackling of the fire and the soft sound of the forest around them. The words were weak, but the intensity in her gaze caught him off guard. She was more aware than he had initially assumed. "I'm getting you out of here," Jason replied as he finished working on the chains. With a sharp tug, they fell apart, and the woman slumped forward into his arms. Jason caught her, his muscles straining as he supported her fragile body. He could feel the weight of her, not just physically but emotionally as well. She was so much more than an alien prisoner to him now. She was a person, someone who had been subjected to unimaginable cruelty. He didn't know who had done this to her or why, but at that moment, it didn't matter. All that mattered was getting her out of this nightmare. He carefully laid her down on the ground beside him, her eyes closing briefly as she exhaled deeply. "I'm here," he whispered, his heart racing as he scanned the area for any other threats. He could still hear the crackling of the fire, the faint, haunting sounds of the tribal aliens moving about in the clearing, but they were now mostly unconscious, incapacitated by his shots. It wouldn't be long before they recovered. He had to act quickly. With a shaky breath, he pulled his gear bag from his shoulder, quickly gathering what he could from the wreckage of the alien camp. His mind was working in overdrive, trying to assess the best escape route while ensuring the woman's safety. The last thing he needed was for those aliens to regroup, to come back and finish what they had started. He could still hear the faint echoes of their guttural voices in the distance, murmurs of anger and confusion. Jason turned back to the woman, who was still weak but now more alert, her eyes scanning her surroundings as she slowly pushed herself up. "We need to move," Jason urged. "Can you stand?" She looked up at him, blinking as if coming out of a fog. She was struggling to focus, her body trembling with exhaustion, but there was something in her gaze that told him she wasn't willing to give up. Not now. Not after everything. With a determined grunt, she pushed herself up, wincing as she shifted her weight. "I can try," she murmured, her voice a strained whisper. "But where?" "Wherever we can get to safety," Jason replied, his voice firm despite the uncertainty in his chest. He looked over his shoulder, at the remnants of the tribal alien camp and the faint glow of the distant mountains, where the rest of the settlement was located. There was no time to waste. The longer they stayed here, the greater the risk. The woman needed help, real medical attention. The tribe would come after them. He reached down to offer his hand, helping her to her feet. She winced again, but she leaned on him, her fragile form relying on his strength. Jason couldn't help but notice how light she felt in his arms. She was malnourished, clearly suffering from more than just the physical wounds. Whoever these tribal aliens were, they had done a number on her, kept her captive, perhaps for far too long. He couldn't help but feel a surge of anger rise in his chest at the thought of the horror she had endured. With slow, calculated steps, they moved toward the edge of the clearing, keeping to the shadows and staying low to avoid being seen. The dense underbrush around them provided cover, but Jason knew they couldn't afford to take too long. The alien woman, whose strength seemed to waver with every step, was more fragile than he'd realized. He had to keep her moving, keep her focused. The night seemed to press in around them, the distant stars offering little comfort in the face of the chaos they were leaving behind. The sounds of the tribal aliens faded behind them, and Jason allowed himself a brief sigh of relief. They were still alive, for now. But how long would it last? He knew the odds. He knew what had happened to others who had come too close to the tribal territories on this planet. The stories from the colony spoke of people who had vanished into the wild, taken by the savage aliens. Jason had always assumed the rumors were exaggerated. But now, standing in the midst of it all, he realized just how real the danger was. They moved for hours through the dense forest, Jason's eyes scanning their surroundings for any signs of pursuit. He kept her close, offering his support as she stumbled more than once. Her breathing was labored, her body fighting against the toll it had taken from her captivity. Yet, there was a resolve in her eyes, a quiet strength that Jason hadn't expected. She was tough, resilient. He admired that. But it wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about escape. They had to get to the settlement. They had to get out of the forest and into the safety of the colony. There, they would find medical help for her. But the deeper they went into the wild, the more it felt like a race against time. Jason's mind whirred with 1,000 questions. What had happened to her? Why was she being held captive by the tribal aliens? Who was she? But those questions would have to wait. Right now, all he could do was keep her alive. Keep them both alive. Chapter 2. The Chase. Jason's heart raced with every step they took, the pounding of his pulse matching the rhythm of his feet against the forest floor. The woman, who had told him her name was Ilya, was struggling to keep up, her fragile form weakening by the minute. Every time they stopped to rest, she seemed to grow more distant, her body on the brink of exhaustion, but her spirit never faltering. It was a strange thing, watching someone who had been so clearly broken in so many ways yet still fighting to survive, to push forward. She had been through something unimaginable, something far beyond Jason's comprehension, and yet, she was still here. She was still alive. But for how much longer? They had reached the edge of the forest now, the tree line beginning to open up to a vast plain. The air was colder here, sharper, as if the forest had protected them from the full bite of the planet's chill. Jason knew they couldn't stay much longer. The sounds of the forest had quieted, and the quiet unease he had felt from the beginning was beginning to settle in his gut like a heavy stone. The tribal aliens weren't far behind. He knew they wouldn't give up easily. And the woman no, Ilyushin wasn't safe yet. He looked down at her again, his heart twisting as she stumbled slightly, her grip on his arm tightening for support. Her eyes were dark with exhaustion, but there was something in them now. Something new. A quiet strength. A purpose. Jason wasn't sure what it was, but he knew she was holding on, not just for herself, but for something else. Something more important than just escaping the forest. "You're doing great," Jason whispered, trying to offer some comfort, though the words seemed hollow in the vast emptiness around them. Ilya looked up at him, a faint smile tugging at her lips. "I'm trying," she said, her voice weak but determined. "I don't know how much further I can go, but I will. I will make it." Jason nodded, pulling her closer as they continued their journey. They had a long way to go before they could reach the settlement, and every step felt like a countdown. The night seemed endless. The stars above them glinted coldly, as if indifferent to their plight. Jason's mind raced as he tried to calculate their chances of making it through the wilderness before the aliens found them. It was a long stretch to the settlement, and the tribal aliens were persistent hunters. They wouldn't stop. But Jason couldn't stop either. He wouldn't stop. Not when he had come this far. Not when he had made a promise, however unspoken, to the woman beside him. The air grew colder as they crossed into the open plain. Ethan could feel the sharp bite of the wind against his skin, the kind of cold that crept into your bones and refused to leave. It was a dangerous place to be exposed, especially for someone as vulnerable as Ilya. She was shivering now, her breaths coming in shallow gasps as she clung to his arm, trying desperately to keep up with his quickened pace. Her fragile body was weakening, but she refused to slow down, her eyes fixed ahead with an intensity that both terrified and amazed him. She was determined to escape this nightmare, to reach safety, but the truth was sinking in. He wasn't sure if they'd make it before the tribal aliens caught up to them. He had no idea how far behind they were, but the forest was vast, and the tribal aliens were no amateurs when it came to hunting. Ilya stumbled again, and this time, Jason caught her before she fell. His heart tightened as he helped her regain her footing, the weight of the situation pressing down on him. He had no idea how much further they had to go, no idea if the settlement would even be able to help them once they arrived. The colony wasn't exactly equipped for emergencies of this nature. They weren't prepared for an alien invasion or a tribal war, but it was all they had, and it was their only hope. "Come on," Jason urged softly, his voice filled with more resolve than he felt. "We're almost there. Just a little longer." She nodded weakly, but he could see the doubt in her eyes. She was exhausted. They both were. Her body had been through hell, and she wasn't going to last much longer if they didn't find shelter soon. Jason's mind raced, trying to think of a way to get them out of this, but there were no shortcuts, no magic tricks. They had to keep moving. The sound of distant footsteps suddenly reached his ears, sharp and uneven, cutting through the silence of the plain. The hairs on the back of his neck stood on end. They were close, too close. Jason's pulse quickened as he turned to Ilya, his voice tense and urgent. "They're coming," he whispered. "We need to get to the ridge. It's the only place they might not find us." Ilya's gaze flicked toward the horizon, her eyes scanning the dark outline of the mountains in the distance. She seemed to understand, even without words, the gravity of the situation. The ridge offered a small glimmer of hope, but it was a long way off, and the tribal aliens were relentless. They wouldn't stop until they had their prize. Without another word, Jason grabbed her hand, pulling her forward as they sprinted across the plain, the cold wind biting at their faces, the fear in Jason's chest growing with each passing step. They had no idea what was waiting for them at the ridge, but they didn't have a choice. They had to keep going. The steps behind them grew louder, closer. Jason's heart thudded in his chest as he turned to glance over his shoulder. The tribal aliens had already broken from the tree line and were now charging across the open ground, their long limbs pushing them forward with unnatural speed. They were fast, relentless, and they weren't far behind. Jason pushed Ilya forward, urging her to go faster, to keep moving, but the exhaustion in her eyes was becoming too much to ignore. She was slowing, her steps faltering with every stride. Jason's chest tightened as he glanced around, trying to figure out their next move. The ridge was still a long distance away, and the aliens were closing in fast. There was no way they could outrun them on foot, not in her condition, Not with the distance they still had to cover. They needed a plan, and they needed it now. "Come on," he urged her, his voice a mix of frustration and desperation. "Just a little further. We can make it. We can dash." A scream cut through the air, high-pitched and filled with agony. It wasn't Ilya. It wasn't the tribal aliens. It was something else. Something far worse. Jason froze, his heart skipping a beat. The scream echoed across the plain, reverberating off the distant mountains. He spun around, his pulse racing as his eyes searched the horizon. What was that? Another person? Another creature? "Go!" Jason hissed urgently, his voice breaking the silence. He didn't know what was out there, but it didn't matter. He couldn't stop to investigate. Not now. But the scream rang out again, more desperate, more primal this time, and something inside Jason's chest twisted. It was a cry for help, not from another human, but from something far worse, a creature that was in even more pain than Ilya. His instincts screamed at him to ignore it, to keep moving, to keep pushing forward. But Jason's heart had always been his greatest strength and his greatest weakness. He couldn't just leave whatever was out there, whatever was suffering. He couldn't leave them to die. "Ilya," Jason said quickly, his voice sharp. "I need you to hide. Get into the trees and stay low. I'll handle this. I'll be right back. Just stay out of sight. Don't move unless I say so." Ilya barely nodded, her strength waning, but there was no hesitation in her movements. She staggered toward the cover of the trees, her fragile form disappearing into the darkened underbrush. Jason turned on his heel, his heart pounding in his chest as he sprinted toward the source of the scream. The creature, whatever it was close. Jason could hear it now, thrashing in the underbrush, the sound of something huge and desperate trying to escape. He had no idea what kind of creature it was. All he knew was that it was in pain, and it needed help, just like Ilya. But the closer he got, the more he realized how wrong this was. There was something unnatural about the sounds it made, something that set his nerves on edge. The screams were punctuated by growls, by whimpering noises that echoed through the dense forest like something truly monstrous. Jason skidded to a halt as he reached a small clearing, his breath coming in sharp bursts as he surveyed the scene in front of him. His stomach churned, and his eyes widened in horror as he saw what lay ahead. A massive creature, nearly 10 feet tall, was pinned to the ground by thick, glowing chains. Its scales glistened under the faint moonlight, and its mouth, filled with rows of jagged teeth, was open in a scream that sent shivers down Jason's spine. It wasn't alien, not in the way he had expected. It was a creature unlike any he had ever seen before, some kind of dragon, but unlike anything from the stories. The tribal aliens surrounded it, using long spears and weapons that crackled with energy to hold it down, to force it into submission. It was a brutal, violent spectacle. Jason's heart raced as he watched. The creature was in agony, and its eyes locked with his in a moment of recognition, of shared pain, and of something else he couldn't quite place. It wasn't fear. It was a silent plea for help. "I'm not leaving you," Jason muttered under his breath, his heart pounding in his chest. He couldn't leave this creature to die like this, not when it was in such pain. But the tribal aliens hadn't noticed him yet. The chaos of the scene distracted them, and Jason seized the opportunity to take a few steps forward, his hand tightening around the plasma rifle in his grip. There was no turning back now. Chapter 3: The Unexpected Ally. Jason's breath hitched as he took a step closer, the heavy weight of his decision settling in his chest. He had no plan, no backup, no real idea of how to help the creature. All he had was instinct, the same instinct that had driven him to help Ilya, to fight his way through the alien forest to get her to safety. But this was different. This creature, this massive, tortured beast, wasn't just helpless. It was a force of nature in pain, its power raw and untamed. It could destroy him in seconds if it wanted to. And yet, there it was, helpless against the chains and the energy-based restraints that kept it in place. The tribal aliens surrounding the creature didn't notice him at first. They were too engrossed in their barbaric display, too focused on subduing the dragon-like creature for whatever twisted ritual they had planned. They had no idea what Jason was capable of, and that, for a brief moment, gave him an edge. The chaos around him, the screams of the tortured beast, the crackling of fire, and the low growls of the tribal aliens drove his focus, narrowing it to one singular goal: helping this creature escape. He stayed low, crouching in the shadows, his pulse thundering in his ears as he moved cautiously around the clearing. The alien dragon, its scales glistening darkly in the low light, shuddered with each new strike of the tribal alien's weapons. Jason's eyes were glued to the creature's face, trying to catch any sign of recognition, of understanding. The creature's eyes met his again, and for the briefest of moments, Jason could see intelligence, an understanding that transcended the pain it was enduring. It wasn't just an animal. It was a sentient being, and it knew exactly what was happening to it. Jason's fingers tightened around the plasma rifle. There was no time to hesitate. He could hear the sound of the tribal aliens chattering growing louder as they prepared to make their next move. He couldn't risk being seen. He had to act. With a steady hand, Jason adjusted his aim. One of the tribal aliens stood closest to the dragon, poking at its exposed side with a spear. Without thinking, Jason fired. The shot was clean, a direct hit to the alien's side, sending the creature tumbling backward with a cry. The others spun around in shock, their eyes wide with confusion. They had no idea where the attack had come from. Jason's heart raced as he used the moment of distraction to fire again, this time striking another alien in the leg, causing it to collapse in pain. "Move!" Jason shouted, his voice louder than he intended, but there was no time for subtlety now. The moment they realized where the shots were coming from, they would be on him in an instant. The dragon's eyes flicked to him again, and Jason saw it, the brief flash of understanding. It wasn't just in pain anymore. It was calculating, assessing its chances. With a low growl, it began to struggle against its chains, its powerful body thrashing against the restraints as it attempted to free itself. The tribal aliens, now realizing what was happening, turned to face him. But they were too late. The dragon, with a mighty roar, snapped the energy chains holding it in place, and the clearing shook with the force of its movements. Jason barely had time to react as the beast, now free, surged forward with an incredible speed and power that sent shockwaves through the ground. It barreled past him, its wings flapping with such force that the wind pushed him backward. The remaining tribal aliens scrambled to recover, but it was already too late. The dragon's sheer power was overwhelming. It swiped its massive tail, knocking one of the aliens into the air, and with a single swipe of its claws, it sent another crashing to the ground. The remaining two tribal aliens turned to flee, but Jason didn't have the time to let them get away. His rifle roared to life once again as he fired at the fleeing aliens, each shot precise. They fell one by one, collapsing into the thick underbrush of the clearing. Silence followed, broken only by the heavy breathing of the dragon as it surveyed the scene. Its amber eyes locked onto Jason's once more, this time filled with a different kind of gratitude, a silent acknowledgement of what had just transpired. Jason could barely comprehend what he had just witnessed. He had freed a massive, intelligent alien creature, one that could have easily killed him if it wanted to, and yet, it hadn't. It hadn't hurt him. Instead, it had been grateful. The woman, Ilya, was still hidden in the trees, and Jason quickly turned back toward her, heart pounding. He needed to get her to safety, to move fast before more enemies arrived. The dragon, this incredible creature, had just given them a chance, and Jason wasn't going to waste it. "Ilya," Jason called out, his voice urgent. "We have to move. Now." She appeared from the shadows, still weak, but now more alert. Her eyes flicked from Jason to the dragon, her face a mixture of awe and disbelief. Is it safe?" she asked, her voice still ragged. "For now," Jason said, looking back at the dragon. The creature seemed to sense their urgency. It let out a low growl, its massive form moving forward as if to protect them. Jason nodded toward the dragon. "We need to keep moving. The tribe won't stop until they've tracked us down." Together, they fled into the trees, the dragon following close behind them, its immense form moving through the forest with astonishing grace. The dense foliage couldn't slow it down. The dragon's wings were folded tightly against its body, but even without them, it moved faster than any creature Jason had ever seen. It was as if the forest itself bent around the creature, clearing a path for it. Ilya stumbled once more, and Jason caught her. "We're close," he said, his voice steady but strained. "The settlement's just over the ridge." She nodded, but Jason could see the exhaustion in her eyes. The pain from her injuries, the mental toll of the past few hours, was taking its toll on her. He couldn't blame her. He could barely keep his own legs moving. But there was something else there, something behind her eyes that told him she wasn't just grateful. She was changed. This ordeal had scarred her, but it had also made her stronger, in ways Jason couldn't fully comprehend. She had survived, and now, she had a purpose. Chapter 4. The Path Forward. By the time they reached the ridge, the night had deepened, and the stars above shimmered with a cold brilliance. Jason looked out across the vast expanse, the faint outline of the colony visible in the distance. It had been hours since the fight with the tribal aliens, but the adrenaline was still coursing through him. His legs ached, his body felt like it had been dragged through a grinder, but there was one overwhelming thought in his mind. They had made it. They were going to survive. The dragon, now walking beside them, seemed to sense the moment of reprieve. Its massive head turned toward Jason and Ilya, its amber eyes watching them with an intensity that made Jason pause. He stopped for a moment, looking at the creature. It had been his ally, his unexpected savior, but there was something more. He owed it more than just a simple thank you. It had risked its life to protect them. It had trusted him. "You don't have to follow us," Jason said quietly, his voice rough from the strain of the day. "You're free now. You've helped us more than we could ever repay. But I can't ask you to keep following us. You should be going wherever you're supposed to be." The dragon's eyes never left his face. There was no sound, no movement, just the weight of its gaze. It took a moment, but then, slowly, the creature nodded. It had no words, no speech like humans used, but it seemed to understand. It would go. It would leave them, for now, to continue on their journey. And yet, as it began to turn away, the hatchling, a small, fragile thing, chirped, almost like a call. The dragon paused, its head tilting, and then, in a moment that surprised Jason, it lowered its head, nudging Ilya with a gentle, protective gesture. The creature's eyes met Ilya's, and for the briefest of moments, there was a wordless exchange. It was almost like a promise. "You're not alone," Ilya whispered, her voice raw but filled with something new: strength, hope. "Thank you." With one last look, the dragon turned and disappeared into the darkened forest, its massive form blending into the shadows like a phantom of the wilds. The hatchling, following closely behind, disappeared from sight, leaving Jason and Ilya standing in the moonlit silence. Jason exhaled deeply, the weight of the moment sinking in. They had made it. They were alive. And as he looked at Ilya, his heart swelled with a mixture of relief and something deeper, something he hadn't expected. The path ahead was uncertain. The galaxy was vast, filled with unknowns, but for the first time, Jason didn't feel so alone. With Ilya beside him, and with the memories of the dragon and its hatchling still fresh in his mind, he knew that they could face whatever came next. Together. And so, they walked toward the colony, their futures uncertain, but for the first time in a long time, filled with possibility.